Smartphone or however you choose to read, or if you can follow along on the screen in just a few minutes. I'm going to start this morning a series that we'll be doing starting today and going for the next few weeks in the book of Galatians. Galatians in the New Testament. It's a rather brief book. It's right after 2 Corinthians, which is a little longer. It makes it easier to find right after that. If you notice the title for the series, #SetFree. #SetFree. We're trying to get modern, trying to get caught up. Actually, the hashtag is the key thing there. It's a way to categorize topics and messages that go out on Twitter and Facebook. And I've actually already started using this. I put this on our Twitter feed and on our Facebook feed. And we'll be using it on our YouTube. And so those who are watching on YouTube or on Facebook, welcome. We're glad you're here, and hope that you can follow us with the #SetFree. Okay. The book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul wrote this letter to the churches that were made up of non-Jewish followers of Jesus in the region of Galatia. It was to a people who had received the gospel earlier when Paul had visited there earlier in his life, and they had experienced a marvelous outpouring of God's amazing grace that we just sang about. They had been set free, even without a hashtag back then. But in the intervening months, after that time when Paul was there and the Spirit was poured out upon them and the grace of God was given to them, and they heard Paul's teaching and his preaching about the freedom that comes in Jesus Christ, there had come among them people known as Judaizers. This was probably some scribes and Pharisees that had grown an affinity for Jesus. You know, most of the time in the New Testament, in the Gospels, when we read about the scribes and Pharisees, they're opposing Jesus. They're arguing with him. They're trying to find a way to kill him. But there were some also, who kind of adopted this attitude. I don't really like what he's saying, but man, he's a good guy. I mean, look at what he's doing. He's healing people and feeding people. He's doing a lot of good things, even if his doctrine's messed up. See, that was some of the Jewish thought. And so some of these Jews that had an affinity for Jesus had followed into Galatia, and they began trying to blend the Jewish tradition with the grace and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so they came in teaching these new believers in Jesus that there were certain Jewish rules and traditions, the Mosaic law, and they told them that you can listen to the teachings of Jesus about loving one another and about feeding the poor and doing all these things that he taught about, but to really be right with God, it's not about faith in Jesus. It's about obedience to the law. And so they confused them, trying to understand the difference between what Paul had taught them and what these Jewish leaders were trying to teach them. Among the most confusing and, dare I say, painful parts is the Judaizers came in and said, "Men, you have to be circumcised." Now, I don't know about you, but that would cause me some problems. So, in the next few weeks, we're not going to talk about that very much, but I want to look at some of Paul's primary teachings in the book of Galatians and how he countered that idea that you have to obey the law and have faith in the law, if you will, as opposed to faith in the grace in Jesus Christ. And surprisingly, that philosophy, it's not so much the Mosaic law, but the Pharisaical philosophy of obeying the law, of working out your salvation and earning your salvation rather than receiving the free gift of grace, that's still far too prevalent in the church today. So we're going to address some of those issues in the next few weeks. Now, this morning, before we actually get into the heart of the letter, the heart of the text, I want to go down one kind of side road to kind of set the stage for this and help us see something that quite honestly, as I have studied and read and looked at the Galatian letter several times in the last 42 years of ministry, something that the Lord just opened my eyes to in recent months. And it is the idea of how Paul begins to approach this very controversial and even destructive topic in the life of the early church. He begins in chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2 by telling them his story. See, I believe everybody has a story to tell. Many of you have heard some of my story, how I was raised in a pastor's home. I was the youngest of 7 children. I struggled with faith for several years from my early teenage years, 11 and 12 years old. I began, it's kind of those inquiring minds want to know kind of thing. I began to question a lot of the things that I had been taught and things that I had heard. For several years, I didn't want to believe in the God that I had heard about all my life. And so I wanted to find something else. I wanted to find something different. I didn't want there to be a God who actually held the whole world in his hand, because if there is a God, then he's in charge. And that means I'm not. And I desperately wanted to be in charge of my own life. And so I went through that phase and those different phases of spiritual journey until I was a freshman in college. Actually, I went through the phases of disbelief, of not believing, not wanting to believe. I went through a religious phase where I searched out a lot of different beliefs and systems of faith, trying to find one that fit what I thought it ought to be. I went through a hypocritical phase where during that time I was out front as a Christian, as a leader in some Bible studies and some Christian activities. But every Friday and Saturday I drank too much alcohol and experienced the things of the mid-1970s. They say if you remember the 70s, you weren't really there. So I've got some memories, but some of them are gone. But anyhow, so I put on that religious mask. But it happened one Friday night as I was drunk driving on the way home that I came very close to a head-on collision that I am convinced, had the collision happened in the way and the situation we were in, would have cost me my life. It would have sent me into eternity unprepared to face the living God that I had questioned. But somehow, miraculously, we missed each other. And after gaining control of the car and rolling out of the car and onto the pavement, I knelt there under a flashing caution light at the intersection of Highway Route 127 and 149. Rick, you know where that's at. And I knelt there. There was a flashing caution light there in the middle of that intersection. I began to pray, and I said, God, if you're really there, if there really is a God, if you're there, if you're listening, if any of this Bible stuff is really true, then I want to know. I want you to come alongside, and would you please clean up my mess and forgive my sin? And right there that night, even though I had played a lot of games with God, I had gone to the altar at every revival and every camp meeting. I had cried crocodile tears. But that night, the Lord got a hold of my heart. And He not only saved me, but He sobered me at that very moment. And I've been walking with Jesus ever since. I experienced His amazing grace. I have a story to tell. I have other stories. We could be here the rest of the day and tomorrow for other stories. But I have a story to tell about His amazing grace. And that's how the Apostle Paul began his approach to this controversial teaching. Let's, for a scriptural reference, look at chapter 1, beginning at verse 11. The scripture says, "For I would have you to know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel." He's starting here, even in telling his story, to make a demarcation. He's saying what the Jewish leaders are telling you is man's gospel. It is man's interpretation. It's man's laws and rules that they are setting in place. But what I taught you is not the man's tradition, man's gospel. Then in verse 12 he says, "I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." And he begins to tell his story about his life. He talks about his life as a Jewish believer and how he persecuted the church and tried his best to destroy it. And then he talked about that Jesus had come into his life. And he talks about his patience in learning. He says that he didn't start immediately, but he took 3 years in Damascus and away from everybody, praying and studying the scriptures and listening to the continuing revelation of Jesus Christ. And then he says that in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem." Now, I tell you what, you look at that, 14 years. Pastor Jim Smalley is going to be ordained into Christian ministry next month. And we're so excited about that. He's been working through the Leadership Focus program for 3 years. And sometimes he said, man, it's taken a long time to get through this. How about Paul? How about 14 years to get credentialed? 14 years he went and met with the leadership of the church, those who seemed to be pillars of the church, James and John and Peter, and they extended to him the right hand of fellowship. And so what he's explaining there is that this gives him some background. It gives him a platform to preach the gospel. Now there's 3 elements of his story, and I'm not taking time this morning to read the entire thing, but it starts with verse 11 in chapter 1 and goes through to verse 10 of chapter 2. I encourage you to read that. But I want to point out 3 things about it. We'll look at some scriptures in that particular point. First of all, his story was authentic. It was authentic. It was very transparent, warts and all. I mean, he didn't try to clean up his mess himself. Look at verses 13 and 14 in chapter 1. He says, "For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." Remember, he said this is not man's gospel. But he says, I was so zealous for the traditions of my father. So he's saying, you know, he's being very authentic with them. He doesn't come across as this high, holy, holier than thou type of personality, saying, "Look at me, I'm saved, I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus, and if you dot all the I's and cross all the T's, then you can be just like me. No, he says, I was lost. I tried to destroy the very thing now that I preach. I was so zealous that I was blinded by the traditions of my father. So he was very authentic with them. His story was accurate. He was telling them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He didn't embellish it. And he didn't diminish it in any way. He knows that to these people that he's writing to, his story might sound over the top. It might sound too dynamic or too incredible to believe. In fact, he recognizes that in verse 20 of the first chapter. He says, in most of the Bibles, it's in a parenthesis. He says, in what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. So he stops kind of in the middle of the story and says, I'm telling you the truth. I'm not lying to you. See? You've heard this. You know this. You can check it out. I'm not afraid of you checking out my story. It's absolutely accurate. Then I believe that because his story was authentic and accurate, that the people then identified with him, because there were those sitting in the audience who at one time would have opposed this gospel. Those who were Gentiles, and Gentiles simply means everybody that's not Jewish. These Gentile Galatians had heard stories about this man Jesus. And more than likely, they were divisive stories, because the people with the megaphones back then, the people, we've always heard the people that write the history are always the winners. And so, at that time, in that culture, in that region, the Pharisees, the scribes were called scribes because they wrote stuff down. So they would have been telling the stories. They identified with him. And they understood his concern and his passion. And now, because of what he's learned on his faith journey, and because he has grown in the faith, it gives him, this story gives him an authority to be heard. We will listen to you because we identify with you. You have something to say to us. One of my favorite television shows was the old show MASH. I've seen every episode 2 or 3 times. I really enjoyed that show. One of the episodes featured the company chaplain. It's kind of interesting that we got all these chaplains here today. It's Chaplain Sunday. But this little mild, meek Catholic chaplain named Father Mulcahy. One episode was titled Mulcahy's War. And it featured him talking with a wounded soldier. And as they talked, the soldier realized that the chaplain had never been to the front line where their actual battles were happening. He had seen the wounds, he had heard the stories, but he had never actually been on the front line. And the soldier said, you don't know what I've seen. You don't know what I've experienced. I have nothing to say to you. And he rolled over and turned his back to the chaplain. And so Father Mulcahy in the show said, I've got to go to the front line. And the commander said, no way. You're not in battle. You're not armed. You're not trained for combat. But he disobeyed orders and found a ride to the front line. He saw the battle. He saw the combat. And on the way back from that front line, he was involved in an emergency where he had to radio in and do an emergency tracheotomy on a wounded soldier. And after he came back, the commander did what commanders do when you disobey orders. He chewed him out. But the last scene, Father Mulcahy went back to the soldier who had turned his back on him. And news had spread fast about his heroics. And the soldier says, I hear you had a pretty exciting day. He said, yeah. And Father McKay, he looked at him and said, now maybe we can talk. And the soldier said, yeah, I'd like to talk. Now, maybe we can talk. Let me tell you another story. When we were pastoring in Lawrenceville, Illinois, it was our first pastorate, and we were doing everything we could think to do to try to help grow that church. And that church had a history of children's ministry. So we tried to reignite the children's ministry. And we had, in the early days there, we had two sisters and a little brother that we would pick up. It was a single mother, and she didn't come, but we would pick up her kids and bring them to Sunday school. And as it turned out, about the second Sunday that they were there, the little boy had an accident and messed his pants. Well, that happens. So we took him and cleaned him. Our house lived immediately next door to the church. I mean, our house was closer to the church than the fellowship hall is to the sanctuary. I mean, we lived immediately next door. So our house became not only the place where the preacher lived, but very convenient for everything else that was needed. We had Bible classes in there. We had the youth group in there. And that Sunday morning, they used our bathtub to go over and clean up the little boy. The next Sunday, he did it again. The third Sunday, I'm sitting in my office at my desk looking over my Bible and my notes, and I look out the window, and I see one of the Sunday school helpers holding a little boy out like this, and they're running across, going to my house. 4 Sundays in a row.
Oh no!
He's messing his pants. Finally, we decided, by that 4th Sunday, first time it's all, second time it's, by the 4th Sunday it's keep that kid at home. And we were preparing to have this talk with the mother and say, until he's better potty trained, we probably need to not bring him. Or you need to come and be prepared to take care of him. But as I was praying and preparing, because that's not really something that you really want to say to an unbelieving single mother. We don't want your child. How do you say that? But I'm convinced the Lord spoke to my heart and helped me to realize that little boy, when he messed his pants, he had discovered that there was going to be a tender hand take care of him. He wasn't going to be beaten. He wasn't going to be cussed or yelled at. A tender hand would take him, would clean him up, would sprinkle some good smelling stuff on his little bottom and put on clean clothes. We got to noticing that we had never picked him up with clean clothes. And so he had discovered in his little mind, he hadn't really thought it out, but he had discovered, when I go there, if I mess my pants, I'll be clean. I'll feel better than I've ever felt. So I called the Sunday school people together and I said, listen, we're not saying a word to that mother. We're going to pick that boy up 15 minutes earlier, and as soon as he gets here, we're going to take him in and give him a fresh pair of pants and clean clothes, and we're going to give him a bath, and we're going to take him to Sunday school. And he never messed his pants again at church. Because he knew he was cared for, and he was loved. The people of our community were willing more to listen to our story because we showed compassion for that little boy. Now, what am I saying here? Here's the thing. Our time together this morning, this sermon is revolved around stories. And I believe there is power in stories to change people's lives, to help people find this freedom to make a difference. One of the things that I hear so often in the life of the church, especially when we preach from Acts 1:8, you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. And from Jesus' commission, go and make disciples. People say, I don't know how to talk to people about Jesus. I don't know how to talk about my faith. I don't know how to start those conversations. I don't know how to do it. And for a long time in the life of the church, if I'm being real honest here, we made it hard. You've got to learn this set of rules. You've got to learn this set of scriptures. You've got to memorize all this. And you've got to be able to follow the rules. It sounds like the Judaizers, doesn't it? Here's a set of rules you've got to follow. I'm convinced that looking at scripture, Jesus told stories. Paul, in this, with something very deep, very controversial, told stories. The stories. This is how it's done. This is how it starts. In my story, everyone who has ever struggled with faith can identify with that. Everyone who has ever overindulged in drugs or alcohol can identify. It gives me a platform to be heard. When I first came to Cape Coral to serve as chaplain at the police department, and I told them about my experience in the corrections system, my experience with police chaplaincy in other states. And I told some of my war stories. They identified, and it gave me a platform to be heard. In Paul's story, the people of the churches of Galatia identified with him in his background. Everyone who has a military background or whoever watched MASH. I mean, at that time, everybody in America watched MASH. Did you know, here's a piece of trivia. Did you know that there was a water crisis in New York City the night of the final episode of MASH? The final episode of MASH was 2 hours long. And when that final scene came up and the show was over and they went to commercial, the alarms at the water system began to sound because they thought they had a major leak. It was simply the fact that everybody in New York City flushed at once. Everybody watched. So if you have a military background, if you have combat background, if you've watched MASH, you can identify with Father Mulcahy. Everyone who's changed a dirty diaper can identify with the teachers and with that little boy. With your story, maybe now we can talk. Everyone has a story to tell. The story of before you came to faith. The story of how you came to faith. The story of what your faith has brought you through since you came to faith. Jesus wants you to know that your story is important. There is power in your story that gives you an authority to be heard. It gives you the platform to speak into people's lives, to change lives. Telling our story is how we build relationships. It's how it begins. Being authentic, being accurate. Your story will resonate with someone just like the Apostle Paul's did, as it gave him the authority and the platform to speak to the Galatians about the difference between the Judaizers demands of the rules of the law and the grace that is found in freedom that is found in Jesus Christ. Your story will resonate with someone else, be it spectacular like Paul's, familiar like mine, common like with the TV character, or just a little messy like that little boy who wanted to feel clean and feel special. And after we connect, we identify with our story. Then Jesus gives us the privilege, the authority to share with the love and the truth of the gospel message of His amazing grace. That's exactly what happens in the book of Galatians with Paul. He starts with his story. It says, because we're now all on the same page, because we identify with each other, let's talk. Let's talk about the truth. Let's talk about set free in Jesus Christ. See, the hashtag set free is part of your story this morning. Our job is simply to go tell your story. And if you're battling with a captivity of any kind, you can be set free just like the Galatians were, just like the story that I was. If you want to spiritually be clean from your mess, Jesus is here to clean up your mess and come alongside you. Set free.
Hi, this is Pastor Don from Waters Edge Church here in Cape Coral, Florida. Thank you for stopping by our YouTube channel to listen in to our Sunday morning preaching services. If you want more information about us, I invite you to check out our webpage at mywatersedgechurch.com, or you can check our Facebook page. Just search for Waters Edge Church, Cape Coral, Florida. Or better yet, I would love to meet you in person. We gather every Sunday morning at 10:30 for a time of inspirational worship and biblically based preaching. We would love to meet you, and we've got a seat here reserved just for you. Hope to see you soon. God bless.